So I want you to imagine, just for a second, the classic stereotypical image of a cultural anthropologist.
Oh, right. You mean like wearing khaki, maybe a pith helmet if we are going really old school.
Exactly, yeah. Sitting quietly in the corner of a village, a totally impartial, silent observer.
Just jotting down notes in a little leather-bound journal.
Right. Trying desperately not to interfere with the subjects, like some sort of, I don't know, academic prime directive.
The whole fly-on-the-wall fantasy. You observe the culture, you document it, but you absolutely do not touch it. You do not change the ecosystem you're studying.
Well, today we are going to completely shatter that image, just break it into a million little pieces.
Yeah, we really are.
Because in this deep dive into our source material, we are heading to Manaus, Brazil. And for those who don't know, Manaus is this massive, sprawling city of nearly 2 million people sitting right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest.
Right, right in the jungle.
And we're looking at a fascinating chapter by an anthropologist who spent time there. Our mission today is to uncover what happens when indigenous people migrate from the forest to this modern city, find their entire identity erased by government bureaucracy, and then
And this is the wild part.
it really is. They cleverly decide to use the very researchers studying them as weapons in their fight for survival.
It completely upends the traditional power dynamic we usually associate with fieldwork.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just fascinating.
Definitely. And before we get too deep, it is worth a quick note to you listening. The source material we are unpacking today dives into some incredibly heavy, politically charged territory.
Yeah, regarding race, state violence, and government policy in Brazil.
Right. And our goal here isn't to take a side or, endorse a specific political viewpoint, but to impartially break down the author's arguments and report on what he observed on the ground.
Absolutely. Just laying out the facts as presented in the source.
Okay, let's unpack this because this isn't just a dry academic debate about research methodology.
Not at all.
The author presents a story about survival. It's about human beings navigating a system that essentially demands they play a stereotype just to possess basic human rights.
So, to understand how different this situation is, you have to look at the mechanics of Brazilian anthropology itself, because the tradition there operates on a fundamentally different frequency than what you might see in, say, the United States or Britain.
How so? Like, what's the main difference?
Well, in North American and British traditions, there has historically been this intense, almost clinical pressure to maintain that objective distance we were just talking about.
Right, the whole don't touch anything rule.
Exactly. The goal is a pristine record. But in Brazil, as the source points out, academic work and political engagement are historically intertwined.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, generations of Brazilian anthropologists have operated under the belief that to study a marginalized group is to advocate for them. The research actually is the advocacy.
Which completely recontextualizes the author's arrival in Manaus. I mean, he shows up to study the Sadaramawe people, and he isn't introduced to them as some detached scientist looking for a good thesis topic.
No. The source describes how he is brought in by a local Catholic priest and linguist.
Right, a priest who works with the Indigenous Missionary Council. And this priest introduces the author as a potential political ally.
They essentially pitch the anthropologist to the indigenous community.
Yeah, they say like, hey, this guy can broadcast your struggles to a massive English-speaking audience.
And that pitch just shifts the entire foundation of his fieldwork from day one. He is not a hidden observer. He is requested to be an asset.
And we see this immediately, right? In his very first active engagement with an urban group of Sadaramawe.
Yeah, it wasn't an interview. It wasn't a survey. It was physical labor.
He helped them repair the thatched roof of their barracam, which is a traditional communal hut used for meetings and rituals.
And the context of why they were repairing that roof is crucial here.
Right, it wasn't because of a bad storm or something. According to the documentation, a white neighbor had intentionally burned the roof down.
Which is just awful.
The author frames this as a racially motivated arson attack designed as a warning against the indigenous group's presence in that urban neighborhood.
So the anthropologist's first day on the job involves literally helping to rebuild after an act of targeted violence.
Wow.
Yeah. That act of rebuilding cements a relationship based on mutual necessity. But if we look at the underlying mechanics of this relationship, what's fascinating here is that we find something revolutionary for traditional anthropology.
Wait, let me push back on this slightly.
Sure.
Because we usually think of the anthropologist as the director, right?
Huh?
The one holding the clipboard, deciding what questions get asked, what data gets collected, and ultimately what the narrative is going to be. So in this scenario, the researcher isn't that one running the show.
That is the core shift. The author introduces the concept of the anthropologist as a political object.
A political object.
Right. The urban Amerindians in Manaus are not passive subjects waiting around to be studied. They possess what sociologists call social agency.
Okay, I see.
They have their own complex political motivations. They recognize that anthropological knowledge, backed by university credentials, is a highly effective tool.
So they engage in a calculated exchange.
Exactly. They provide the anthropologist with the cultural data, the songs, and the autobiographical memories he needs for his book. But the mechanism of this trade requires him to act as a megaphone.
I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of that megaphone, though. Like, how does a researcher actually help them? Are we talking about him writing op-eds in the local paper or what?
It's more structural than that. Because the anthropologist has academic legitimacy, his field notes and published papers become official, citable documentation.
Oh, I get it. So international non-governmental organizations can take that English language research, put it in front of a judge or a human rights council, and use it as evidence.
Yes. Evidence that these people have a distinct cultural identity and a right to the land. The urban Amerindians are essentially crowdsourcing an international lobbyist to apply pressure on the Brazilian government.
That is incredibly smart. But so if they are successfully lobbying for their rights using these researchers, why are they still so invisible to the state?
Well,
Because according to the text, there is a massive discrepancy in the sheer math of who lives in the city.
the demographic reality of Manaus is incredibly stark. Depending on the independent estimates cited in the source material, there are somewhere between 15,000 and 35,000 Amerindians living in the city.
But if you look at the official Brazilian census, specifically the one from 2010, they only counted about 3,800 indigenous people in Manaus.
Right.
If you're listening to this and wondering how a government can just erase tens of thousands of people on paper, it honestly boggles the mind. Why is the census missing them, and why are so many indigenous people moving to the city in the first place?
Okay, so the migration itself follows very standard rural to urban patterns. They are moving to Manaus for better economic opportunities, access to electricity, running water.
Just basic stuff.
Yeah. They're looking for schools for their children and hospitals for their elders. And sometimes they are simply migrating to escape a lack of resources on the interior reservations.
And when they arrive, they often end up living in marginalized squatter settlements on the outskirts of the city.
Right. But that bureaucratic erasure you just mentioned, that mathematical discrepancy, it happens mechanically the moment they step foot in the urban environment.
And that's largely due to the policies of OENAI, right?
Yeah.
The National Indian Foundation in Brazil.
Exactly.
The source details this incredibly frustrating catch-22 with FUNAI. Once an indigenous person moves to the city, the government bureaucracy essentially slaps a label on them as civilized or detribalized.
The author uses this fascinating term for it, the hyper-real Indian.
The hyper-real Indian.
Yeah, it refers to this romanticized, completely static image of an indigenous person living a purely primitive life in a pristine, untouched forest.
And because the urban migrants don't fit that extreme, rigid stereotype, the government strips them of their official indigenous recognition.
The bureaucratic mechanics of that stripping process are just devastating. When they lose that recognition, they lose their specific tribal heritage on paper, whether they are Settler Mawe, Jukano, Kokamo, or any other distinct group.
It's all just wiped away.
Yeah. Instead, census workers and bureaucrats recategorize them using broad, generic racial terms. They get lumped into the category of Pardo, which translates to brown, or Caboclo.
And caboclo historically refers to someone of mixed indigenous and European descent, right?
Correct. By simply checking a different box on a government form, the state effectively dissolves their indigenous identity, and consequently their land rights and specific social protections.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like treating indigenous identity like a historical reenactment park.
Well, that's a good way to put it.
The government is basically saying, listen, if you step out of character for 1 second to check a cell phone, or take a public bus, or get a job on a construction site to feed your family, you aren't a real Indian anymore, and your rights are revoked.
That is exactly what is happening. The author contrasts this situation with how indigenous identity is often perceived in the United States to highlight just how unique this bureaucratic erasure is.
Because it's very different in the U.S.
Right. In the U.S., the phrase urban Indian might carry certain sociological stereotypes, perhaps bringing to mind images of inner-city struggles or ghettoization. But crucially, their existence as an indigenous person isn't inherently denied by the fact that they live in a city.
Right. Moving to Denver or Seattle doesn't legally make you non-indigenous.
Exactly. But in Brazil, the state views an urban Indian as an oxymoron. In the eyes of the white Brazilian establishment, you are either a primitive in the forest or you have become white or mixed. The geography itself dictates your identity.
Which puts these urban communities in an impossible situation. I mean, if the state bureaucracy demands a pure, unblemished stereotype to grant you your basic legal existence, how do you even counter that?
Well, according to the source, you fight back by weaponizing their own visual expectations against them.
Which brings us to what the source calls political rituals.
Yes. These urban Amerindians realize they have to find undeniable ways to demarcate the borders between themselves and white society.
Which they refer to as kariwa, right?
Right, the Kariwa. They have to force the state to see them.
And the way they do this is striking. On public occasions, like the National Day of the Indian on April 19th or during political protests in the city squares, they don't just show up in T-shirts and jeans holding picket signs.
No, they adorn themselves in full traditional paint. The leaders wear elaborate feathered headdresses called coquers. They make a deliberate, highly visible choice to perform their indigeneity.
And here's where it gets really interesting. One of the most intense examples of this documented in the text is the performance of the Tukandera dance by the Sadare.
Yeah, this is a traditional rite of passage ritual for young men, and it involves wearing gloves that are woven with hundreds of stinging bullet ants.
Bullet ants, just wow.
Yeah, the Paraponera clavata.
Yeah.
It is an excruciatingly painful ritual. The venom from these ants causes systemic pain, and the ritual is designed to prove absolute endurance and physical strength.
The juxtaposition here is incredible. I mean, you have these communities who are actively participating in modern urban life. The source mentions them watching televisions, using VCRs, surfing the internet, and navigating city transit.
Right.
But then, right in the middle of a modern metropolis, they publicly perform a highly traditional, incredibly painful ritual with bullet ants. At first glance, it almost seems like a paradox.
It only seems like a paradox if we view culture as something that has to remain frozen in the past. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author introduces the concept of neo-indigeneities to explain this.
Neo-indigeneities.
Right. It is vital to understand that these are not what some academics might call post-traditional people who have forgotten their culture and are desperately trying to cling to the past.
They aren't just LARPing their own history.
No, not at all. They are fully aware of the modern world. They happily accept the aspects of modern life that help them survive. But they strategically use these extreme, undeniable markers of their traditional culture to force white society to recognize their distinct identity.
It's more like a legal watermark. Think about how a digital photo might have a visible watermark stamped across it to prove ownership in space where things are easily copied or erased.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
These communities are using extreme traditional markers, like the bullet ant gloves or the coquers, as an undeniable cultural watermark to prove they still exist to a state that refuses to see them.
It is a highly self-aware strategy to reify their difference, to say, we are here, we are modern, but we are unequivocally still indigenous. They manipulate the visual expectations of the bureaucracy for their own political survival.
But we have to be careful not to make this sound like it's just a clever debate over cultural performance or like a paperwork dispute with a census bureaucrat.
Right, because the stakes are physical.
Yeah.
This is a fight for safety against what the author details as systemic, often brutal violence.
Yeah. The political performance we just discussed is born directly out of intense trauma and marginalization.
The source shares this incredibly visceral, disturbing account of a woman named Ileana who is Sadaremawe.
Yeah, in March of 2008.
Right. There was an occupation at a vacant plot of land near Manaus called Lago Azul. About 200 Amerindians from various ethnic groups had staked a claim there as homesteaders, trying to secure a place to live.
And the response from the state, according to the text, was to send in 150 military police. And they didn't come with mediators.
No, they came with batons, shields, rifles, tear gas, and pepper spray. The details documented from Ileana's account are harrowing.
She recounts how the police violently cleared the camp, and she was pregnant at the time, physically holding her small baby. It's just horrifying. She describes the military police choking her husband with a baton. When an officer hit her on the arm, they were screaming at her, calling the indigenous people invaders.
And the most chilling part of her account, which ties right back into that FUNAI bureaucracy we just discussed, is the specific insult the police yelled at her.
Right. They screamed, "You are not an Indian, and you are civilized."
The police were weaponizing her urban presence against her. They used her location in the city as a justification for the violence, claiming she had no right to the land because she wasn't a real Indian anymore.
Which is just so incredibly dark.
It is. And this raises an important question about how we understand and categorize trauma, particularly in a Western context.
The author brings in the work of psychiatrists Didier Fassin and Richard Rechtman for this, right? The authors of The Empire of Trauma.
Yes. He uses their framework to show how Western psychology often views traumatized people purely as passive victims.
Like we clinicalize their suffering.
Exactly. We might diagnose it as post-traumatic stress disorder, treating it as an individual psychological injury that needs to be healed in a therapist's office so the person can quietly return to normal society.
The focus is almost entirely on victimhood in recovery.
But the author argues that what we are seeing in Manaus requires a completely different lens. He calls it the politics of trauma.
The politics of trauma. So how does that work in practice?
Well, the indigenous groups in Manaus are experiencing profound trauma, but he breaks it down into two types. There is episodic trauma like the terrifying acute police attack at Lago Zilum.
The isolated events.
Right. But there is also what he calls diachronic trauma.
And if you're listening and wondering what diachronic trauma means, think of it as an inherited compounding debt of grief.
That's a great way to describe it.
It is the constant, everyday structural racism that doesn't just happen once, but traces its roots all the way back through hundreds of years of colonial history.
Specifically, the source connects it back to the horrors of the rubber boom era in the Amazon during the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right, because during that time, the global demand for rubber led to indigenous people being forced into deadly debt peonage systems.
They were enslaved, tortured, and displaced from their ancestral lands. The diachronic trauma is the ripple effect of that historical violence directly shaping the urban poverty line in Manaus today.
So, if I am tracking the argument correctly, these communities aren't just suffering in silence, and they certainly aren't letting the trauma turn them into passive patients.
No, not at all.
So they are intentionally taking the memory of this violence, both the historical compounding debt of the rubber boom and the present-day violence of the military police, and they are using it as fuel. They are using it as the connective tissue for a civil rights movement.
Exactly. They possess primary agency. They use the shared experience of trauma and discrimination to maintain their political movements against the establishment.
It gives them a unified moral imperative to fight back.
Right, to demand better health care, to demand recognition, and to overcome the systems marginalizing them. It becomes a unifying force that helps bridge the linguistic and cultural gaps between different ethnic groups.
Like the Sadare Mawe, the Tucano, and the Kokama.
Yeah, bringing them together into a powerful Pan-Amerindian movement within the city.
They take the very trauma designed to break them and forge it into a shield for their own survival. Which, honestly, brings us full circle back to the role of the anthropologist we started with.
It really does.
Because when the author sits down and documents Ileana's terrifying account of the police raid, or when he records the history of the rubber boom, he isn't just taking field notes to gather dust in a university archive.
He is fulfilling his end of the bargain. He is taking their raw, painful realities and broadcasting them to the English-speaking world. He is generating the academic paper trail they need.
He is acting as the political object they explicitly requested him to be. Okay, let's bring everything we've talked about today back to the surface. We started this journey looking at the shattered myth of the objective, totally detached researcher.
We saw how, in the complex, politically charged environment of urban Brazil, anthropologists become necessary tools for marginalized communities.
And we explored the impossible bureaucratic catch-22 of urban indigenous identity, how moving to a city for a better life means the government suddenly declares you mathematically and legally invisible.
We also unpacked how these communities respond not by fading away, but by strategically weaponizing tradition. They adopt neo-indigeneities, using rituals like the Tukandera dance as cultural watermarks.
And they use their shared diachronic trauma as the unshakable foundation for a resilient political resistance.
It's a testament to their adaptability and strength.
It really makes you reflect on how societies operate as a whole. I mean, think about your own community, or how often society at large demands absolute purity from marginalized groups before it is willing to believe their struggles are valid.
It's so common. We set up these impossible authenticity traps where a person has to perfectly perform their disadvantage or perfectly encapsulate their heritage just to be taken seriously by the majority.
But as the urban Amerindians of Manas prove, survival rarely looks like a perfectly preserved museum exhibit. True survival requires adapting the tools of the modern world, whether that is a public bus, a cell phone, or even a visiting academic, while fiercely defending the roots of your past.
It is a delicate, dangerous balance.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We started by breaking the glass of the impartial observer. But let's look at the system itself. If a government or any society ties a culture's legal right to exist entirely to an idealized, frozen-in-time version of its ancient past, well, wait, how can any marginalized culture ever hope to evolve without risking its own extinction?
A vital question for anyone trying to navigate identity and bureaucracy in the modern world.
Truly. That is all for today's deep dive into the source material. Keep questioning the stereotypes, and we'll catch you on the next one.